Benjamin sat in the corner of the tiny living room, clutching his knees to his chest. His stomach growled loudly, and he pressed his hand against it, hoping to silence the noise. His head felt heavy, his body weak from days without proper food. "Auntie, please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Can I have something to eat?" Auntie Nkem didn't even look at him. She sat on her stool, peeling yam, her movements sharp. "There's no food for you," she snapped. "You think food falls from the sky? Lazy boy like you should go and fend for himself." Benjamin bit his lip to stop the tears from falling. His chest heaved with suppressed sobs, but he didn't dare cry out loud. He had learned the hard way that crying only made things worse with Auntie Nkem. The sun set slowly outside, and darkness crept into the small house. Benjamin hadn't gone out to sell oranges that day. When Auntie Nkem handed him the tray that morning, he had collapsed to the floor, too weak to stand. She had shouted at him, called him useless, and then left him alone in the house while she went to the market. Now, as the silence of the night closed in, Benjamin's hunger became unbearable. His small body shook as the tears he had been holding back burst forth. He cried quietly at first, the sound of his sobs barely audible. But as the pain in his stomach grew sharper, his cries became louder. "Keep quiet." Auntie Nkem backed from her room. "Stop making noise, or I will come out there and deal with you." But Benjamin couldn't stop. The hunger, the sadness, the loneliness, it was all too much for him to bear. He cried harder, his voice echoing through the small house. Auntie Nkem stormed out of her room, her face twisted with anger. "You this boy, you won't let me sleep, eh?" she yelled. She grabbed him roughly by the arm and dragged him toward the door. "If you want to cry so much, go outside and cry. I don't have time for your nonsense." Benjamin struggled weakly against her grip, but he was no match for her strength. She shoved him out of the house and slammed the door behind him. The cool night air hit his face, and he stood there for a moment, shivering and sobbing. He didn't know where to go at that time or what to do. His bare feet felt cold against the hard ground. But then, as if by instinct, his legs began to move. He walked slowly, his small frame trembling with every step, until he found himself on the familiar path to the cemetery. The moon hung high in the sky. The sight of his mother's grave brought a fresh wave of tears to his eyes. He stumbled toward the unmarked mound of earth and collapsed beside it, clutching the dry soil with his small hands. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't stay there anymore. Auntie Nkem doesn't want me. She doesn't love me. I'm so hungry, Mama. I don't know what to do." To Benjamin, it felt like his mother's spirit was there, comforting him, telling him he wasn't alone. He lay down on the ground, curling up beside the grave, and let his tears flow freely. "I'm not going back, Mama," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'd rather stay here with you. I don't want to go home." The cool earth beneath him felt soothing against his aching body. For the first time that day, he felt a small sense of peace. Slowly, his sobs quieted, and his breathing became steady. He closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion take over, and soon, he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the sun rose slowly. Birds chirped in the trees, and the air was cool and fresh. Benjamin stirred, his small body stiff from sleeping on the ground. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and looked around. The graveyard was quiet, peaceful. For a moment, he almost forgot about the hunger, the pain, the fear. But reality came crashing back as his stomach growled loudly. He clutched his belly, wincing at the sharp ache. Then, he noticed something. Beside his mother's grave, on the same flat rock where he had found the plate of food before, there was a small bundle wrapped in a cloth. His heart raced as he reached out with trembling hands and unwrapped it. Inside was a loaf of bread and a small bottle of water. The sight brought tears to his eyes. He didn't know who had left it there or why, but in that moment, he didn't care. His hunger was too great. He took a bite of the bread, savoring the soft, sweet taste, and drank deeply from the bottle. The water was cool and refreshing, and for the first time in days, he felt a small measure of relief. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how, but I know you're helping me." Back at the house, Auntie Kem paced the living room, her face a mask of anger and frustration. She had expected Benjamin to return after cooling off, but when she woke up and found the house still empty, a pang of worry crept into her chest. "Where is that boy?" she muttered to herself. "He thinks he can run away. He'll come back when he gets hungry." But as the hours passed and there was still no sign of him, her anger turned to unease. She stepped outside, scanning the empty street. "Benji," she called, her voice echoing in the quiet morning. "Come back here, you useless boy." There was no response. She walked down the road, asking the neighbors if they had seen him, but no one had. Auntie Kem's heart began to race. She didn't care much for the boy, but the thought of something happening to him filled her with dread. What would people say if he didn't come back? What if something terrible had happened to him? She searched the village, her voice growing louder and more desperate with each passing hour. "Benji, where are you?" But Benjamin was nowhere to be found. At the cemetery, Benjamin sat quietly beside his mother's grave, the empty cloth bundle beside him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to Auntie Kem's house. He would rather sleep on the ground, hungry and alone, than face her harsh words and cruel beatings again. As the day wore on, he stayed by the grave, feeling a strange sense of comfort in its silence. He didn't know how long he could survive like this, but for now, he felt safe. And that was enough. Episode 2. Benjamin spent most of the day sitting by his mother's grave, his small frame leaned over as he gazed at the mound of earth. The bread and water he had eaten earlier had given him some strength, but his hunger returned quickly, gnawing at his insides like a persistent ache. Later, the heat became unbearable, and the cemetery felt quiet. Benjamin stood up, wiping the sweat from his forehead, and decided to explore the area. He wandered through the graveyard, his bare feet crunching over dried leaves and twigs. At the edge of the cemetery, he noticed a cluster of trees, their branches heavy with fruits. His eyes lit up with hope. Carefully, he climbed up one of the smaller trees, his hands gripping the rough bark. He reached for a ripe mango, plucked it, and held it to his nose, savoring its sweet aroma. He climbed down and quickly ate the mango, its juicy flesh dripping down his chin. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it gave him the energy to keep going. Encouraged, he plucked more fruits, guavas, bananas, and a few pawpaws from the nearby trees. He carried them back to his mother's grave and laid them down on the flat rock beside him. "Mama, I brought us something to eat," he whispered, his voice soft and filled with longing. He imagined her smiling at him, telling him he had done well. He sat cross-legged on the ground, eating slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a feast. The fruits filled his empty stomach, and for a brief moment, he felt a sense of satisfaction. But deep down, he still longed for more, a proper meal like the ones his mother used to cook for him. As the day turned to evening, the shadows in the cemetery grew longer, and a cool breeze swept through the trees. Benjamin remained by the grave, his thoughts drifting to his mother and the life they had before everything changed. Later that night, Benjamin sat alone on the grave, his thin arms wrapped around his knees. The night was quiet. He tilted his head back and looked up at the sky, his small face edged with sadness. "I wish I could have fufu and egusi soup, Mama," he murmured. His mother's egusi soup had been his favorite. He could almost taste the rich, nutty flavor and feel the warmth of the soft, stretchy fufu in his hands. The thought made his stomach growl loudly, but he sighed, knowing it was just a wish. The cool night air brushed against his face, and Benjamin shifted uncomfortably. He realized he needed to ease himself. Standing up slowly, he made his way to a bushy area at the edge of the cemetery. The darkness made it hard to see, but he moved carefully, his bare feet brushing against the grass. When he finished, he walked back toward his mother's grave, the familiar path bringing him a small sense of comfort. But as he approached the grave, he stopped suddenly, his heart pounding in his chest. There, on the flat rock beside the grave, was a plate of steaming fufu and egusi soup. Beside it was a bottle of water, its surface glistening in the moonlight. Benjamin froze, his eyes wide with shock. The aroma of the food filled the air, rich and inviting, making his mouth water instantly. He blinked several times, rubbing his eyes to make sure he wasn't dreaming. But the food was still there, sitting on the rock as if someone had just placed it there. His heart raced as he stepped closer, his small hands trembling. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaky. Is this from you?" The cemetery was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Benjamin looked around, searching for any sign of another person, but there was no one. The air felt strange, almost heavy, as if something beyond his understanding had just happened. He knelt down beside the rock, his eyes fixed on the plate of food. The fufu was warm and soft, and the egusi soup was thick and fragrant, filled with pieces of meat and fish. The sight brought tears to his eyes. He couldn't believe it. He had only wished for the food a short while ago, and now it was here, as if someone had heard his cries. With trembling hands, he reached out and picked up a piece of the fufu. It was warm to the touch, and he dipped it into the egusi soup, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he brought it to his mouth and took a bite. The flavors exploded on his tongue, rich and savory, just like he remembered. Tears streamed down his face as he ate, the warmth of the food filling his empty stomach and bringing a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in so long. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered between bites, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how, but I know you're helping me." As he ate, Benjamin felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The fear and sadness that had consumed him earlier seemed to fade away, replaced by a feeling of warmth and love. It was as if his mother's presence was all around him, watching over him, protecting him. When he finished the meal, he placed the empty plate and bottle back on the rock. He sat quietly for a while, staring at the grave, his mind racing with questions. Who had left the food? Was it really his mother's spirit, or was someone else watching over him? The thoughts filled him with a mixture of wonder and fear. The night grew colder, and Benjamin wrapped his arms around himself, his body tired but his heart a little lighter. He lay down beside the grave, resting his head on his arm, and stared up at the stars. As he drifted off to sleep, he whispered softly, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you for taking care of me." Benjamin slept peacefully, feeling a love that transcended the boundaries of life and death. Benjamin lay curled up beside his mother's grave. That night, he had a dream so vivid it felt real. In his dream, he saw his mother, dressed in her favorite wrapper and blouse, her kind face glowing with a soft light. She knelt beside him, her hand gently brushing his cheek. Her touch was warm and comforting, and Benjamin felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Benjamin," she said softly, her voice like a melody he hadn't heard in so long. "My child, you are strong, but you cannot live like this. You need to go to school. There is a community primary school in the village. Go there and enroll. It's time for you to start learning again." "But Mama," he stammered, his voice trembling. "What about the money? How will I pay for school?" She smiled gently, her eyes filled with love. "Don't worry, my child. I will take care of everything. Trust me." Before he could say another word, she faded away, her voice lingering in the air. "Go to school, Benjamin. It's what you need." Benjamin woke with a start, the faint light of dawn beginning to creep across the sky. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat up, his mother's words echoing in his mind. He looked around, trying to make sense of the dream, when his eyes fell on something unusual. There, beside the grave, was a small bundle of money. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his eyes widening in shock. The notes were crumpled but clean, and it was just enough for him to enroll in school. "Mama," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you." Later that morning, Benjamin made his way to the community primary school. The school was a small building with peeling walls and a rusty iron gate, but to Benjamin, it felt like a place of hope. He clutched the money tightly in his hands as he walked through the gate, his bare feet stirring up dust on the ground. As he entered the school compound, curious eyes turned to him. The children, dressed in faded uniforms, whispered among themselves, and some of the teachers paused what they were doing to glance his way. Benjamin felt nervous, but he kept walking, his head held high. "Isn't that Benjamin?" one of the students whispered to another. I heard his auntie has been looking for him everywhere. Yes, another replied. He's the boy who sells oranges in the village. What's he doing here? Benjamin ignored the whispers and approached a teacher standing near the staff room. She was a kind-looking woman with short, neat hair and a warm smile. Good morning, Mo, Benjamin said, his voice small but steady. I want to enroll in this school. The teacher looked at him, surprised. Enroll, she asked, glancing at his torn shirt and dusty shorts. Where are your parents, child? They're gone, Mo, Benjamin replied, his eyes downcast. I live alone now. Her face softened with sympathy, and she nodded. Come with me. She took him to the head teacher's office, where Benjamin handed over the money and explained that he wanted to start school. The head teacher, a stern-looking man with glasses patched on his nose, studied him carefully before nodding. All right, Benjamin, he said. We'll enroll you. Classes have already started, but you can join the others today. Do you have any books or a uniform? No, sir, Benjamin replied quietly. The teacher who had brought him in spoke up. I'll see if we can find something for him, sir. He looks like he needs help. The head teacher nodded, and Benjamin was officially enrolled. As he walked to his new classroom, the whispers and stares followed him. Some of the students who recognized him tried to talk to him. Benjamin, your auntie has been looking for you, one girl called out. She's been asking everyone in the village where you are. Benjamin didn't reply. He kept his head down and focused on the path ahead. He didn't want to think about Auntie Nkem or her harsh words. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going back. After the morning lessons, the teacher who had helped him, Miss Grace, called him aside. She was young, with a kind face and gentle eyes. Benjamin, she said, her voice soft, I heard what some of the students were saying. Are you really living alone? Yes, Mo, he replied, his voice steady. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. Where do you sleep, my dear? Do you have a place to stay? Benjamin looked up at her, his eyes calm but filled with sadness. I sleep at my mother's grave, Mo. Miss Grace's eyes widened in shock. What? The cemetery? Benjamin, you can't stay there. It's dangerous, and it's no place for a child. I'm fine, Mo, he said firmly. It's quiet there, and I feel close to my mother. I don't want to leave. Miss Grace's heart broke at his words. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Benjamin, if you need a place to stay, you can come live with me. I'll take care of you. He shook his head quickly. Thank you, Mo, but I'm okay. I want to stay with my mother. Miss Grace sighed, her heart heavy with worry. She didn't know how to convince him, but she decided not to push him for now. The next day, during the morning assembly, the quiet atmosphere of the school was disrupted. A loud voice rang out near the gate. Benjamin! Benjamin, where are you? It was Auntie Nkem, her face red with anger as she marched into the school compound. The students and teachers turned to look, their eyes wide with curiosity. Benjamin froze, his heart pounding. He had been expecting this, but it didn't make it any less frightening. As Auntie Nkem spotted him, she stormed toward him, her voice sharp and accusing. You this boy. So this is where you've been hiding. You think you can run away from me? The head teacher stepped forward, trying to calm her down. Madam, please, let's handle this calmly. Benjamin has enrolled in our school and... School? Auntie Nkem interrupted, her voice dripping with disbelief. This boy doesn't need school. He needs to come back home and work. He's been living off me for too long. The students whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Benjamin and his furious aunt. Benjamin stood still, his small frame trembling, but his eyes were steady. I'm not going back, he said firmly, his voice surprising even himself. I'm staying here. Everyone fell silent. Even Auntie Nkem looked stunned for a moment. Then her shock turned to anger. What do you mean you're not coming back? You're a child. You don't get to decide. I'm not coming back, Benjamin repeated, his voice louder this time. I'm staying near my mother. I sleep at her grave, and I'm fine." The gasps that followed were audible. The teachers exchanged worried glances, and some of the students looked terrified. Miss Gray stepped forward, her face pale. "Benjamin," she said gently, "you can't live in the cemetery. It's not safe." But Benjamin stood his ground. "It's my home now," he said quietly. "It's where I feel close to my mother." The head teacher rubbed his temples, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Auntie Kem, on the other hand, looked furious. "You're coming with me, whether you like it or not," she snapped, grabbing his arm. Benjamin pulled away, his voice rising. "No. I'm not going with you. You don't care about me. You only beat me and starve me. I'm better off alone." The crowd fell silent again, shocked by his outburst. Auntie Kem looked around, her face flushing with embarrassment. She tried to grab him again, but Miss Gray stepped in. "Madam, please," she said firmly. "Let's handle this properly. The boy needs help, not force." Benjamin stood there, his small body trembling but his resolve unshaken. He had made his choice, and no one could change his mind. Auntie Kem left the school that morning, her face flushed with anger and shame. The teachers and students watched her go, murmuring quietly among themselves. Everyone was shocked by what they had heard: Benjamin sleeping in a cemetery, refusing to return home. After the morning assembly, many people tried to talk to Benjamin. Teachers approached him, offering him a place to stay, but he shook his head firmly. "Thank you, Ma," he said politely, "but I don't want to leave my mother. I feel safe near her grave." Some of the older students also spoke to him during the break, trying to persuade him. "Benjamin, it's dangerous to stay there alone," one boy said. "What if something happens to you?" "I'm fine," Benjamin replied, his voice steady. "Nothing will happen to me." The whisper spread quickly around the school. Everyone seemed to know Benjamin's story by the end of the day. Some pitied him, others were afraid, but Benjamin remained calm. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't going back to Auntie Kem's house, no matter what. When the school day ended, Benjamin picked up his bag of donated books and started the familiar walk back to the cemetery. His stomach growled as he walked, but he didn't feel worried. For some reason, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if he knew his mother would take care of him. When he reached the cemetery, the sight of his mother's grave filled him with relief. He approached the mound of earth slowly, his heart pounding softly in his chest. Then he stopped in his tracks. On the flat rock beside the grave, there was a plate of steaming rice and a bottle of water. Benjamin's eyes widened in surprise. The rice smelled delicious, with bits of vegetables and fried plantains on the side. The bottle of water sparkled in the fading sunlight. He looked around the graveyard, but it was empty. The breeze rustled the trees softly, and the only sound was the chirping of distant crickets. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Did you do this again?" His hands trembled as he picked up the plate and bottle. He sat down beside the grave and began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. The rice was warm and flavorful, filling his empty stomach with much-needed comfort. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he whispered softly, "Thank you, Mama. You always take care of me." When he finished eating, Benjamin placed the empty plate back on the rock and sat quietly for a moment. The cemetery was peaceful, and the evening breeze cooled his face. But as night fell, the air grew colder, and Benjamin realized he needed better shelter. He stood up and wandered around the graveyard, looking for sticks and dry leaves. It was the dry season, so there were plenty of fallen branches scattered around. Carefully, he gathered the sticks and tied them together with strips of cloth he found near an abandoned grave. Slowly, he built a small tent beside his mother's grave, arranging the leaves to cover the top. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at his work. The tent was small and flimsy, but it was enough to keep him warm at night. He crawled inside and sat cross-legged, feeling proud of his little home. "Mama," he said softly, "I'll stay here with you. I'm not going anywhere." The next day, Auntie Kem couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the school. She was furious that Benjamin had refused to come home and even more embarrassed by how the teachers and students had looked at her. She decided she would go to the cemetery and drag him back herself. That evening, as the sun began to set, Auntie Kem marched to the graveyard, her face twisted with determination. She muttered angrily under her breath as she walked. "That boy thinks he can embarrass me. I'll show him." When she reached the cemetery, she paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the rows of graves. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. But Auntie Kem wasn't afraid. She spotted Benjamin's little tent beside the grave and stormed toward it. "Benjamin," she shouted, her voice echoing in the still air. "Come out here right now." Benjamin crawled out of the tent slowly, his face calm but tired. "What do you want, Auntie?" he asked quietly. "What do I want?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I want you to stop this nonsense and come back home. You're making me look like a fool in front of the whole village." "I'm not coming back," Benjamin said firmly, standing his ground. "I'm staying here with my mother." Auntie Kem's face turned red with anger. "You this stubborn boy. I'll drag you back myself." She reached out to grab him, but just as her hand was about to touch him, something strange happened. A sharp, invisible force struck her face, like a slap from nowhere. She stumbled back, clutching her cheek in shock. "What was that?" she shouted, her eyes darting around wildly. The air felt heavy, and a strange chill swept over her. The shadows around the grave seemed to deepen, and the trees shook loudly as if warning her to leave. Auntie Kem tried to step forward again, but this time, the slap was even harder, sending her sprawling to the ground. She screamed, scrambling to her feet and clutching her head. "Who's there? What is this?" Benjamin stood still, watching her with wide eyes. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt no fear. In fact, he felt a strange sense of protection, as if his mother's spirit was watching over him. Auntie Kem didn't wait to find out what had hit her. She turned and ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her screams echoing through the cemetery. "Leave me alone. Leave me alone," she shouted as she disappeared into the distance. Benjamin stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. The graveyard was silent again, and the air felt calm. He turned back to his mother's grave and knelt down. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "You're still protecting me." He crawled back into his tent, curling up inside and closing his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt truly safe. The night passed peacefully, the stars twinkling above, and Benjamin slept soundly, knowing he wasn't alone. Did you enjoy this story? What stood out for you in the story? Did you learn something? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you get notified when the next video is out. Thank you for watching.